The strange widow who lived beside the cemetery. In a quiet, forgotten town surrounded by misty hills and ancient forests, there stood a cemetery that had long been abandoned by the living. The townsfolk avoided it, not because they no longer honored their dead, but because of the eerie presence that lingered there, right next to its rusted iron gates, in a house that looked as though it had been built out of the same stone as the graves themselves, lived a woman everyone referred to as the widow. No one remembered her real name. Some said she had once been beautiful. Others claimed she had always been pale, withdrawn, and spectral. But what united every whisper and rumor was one chilling truth. She had lived alone beside the cemetery for decades, and no one in town could recall ever seeing her leave. The house itself was a relic of the past. Its windows were veiled by moth-eaten curtains, and its roof sagged under the weight of moss and time. At night, faint lights flickered inside, like candles burning for souls long departed. The townsfolk avoided even walking past it after sundown, convinced that the widow was more shadow than flesh, more memory than human being. Children dared each other to run up the stone path and touch the door, but no one ever knocked. For as far back as anyone could recall, no visitor had crossed her threshold. Legends spread like wildfire among the townspeople. Some claimed the widow was cursed, forced to dwell forever on the edge of death's domain. Others said she had buried her husband in that cemetery and, in her grief, made a pact with forces best left unnamed. The most disturbing rumor, however, was that she wasn't living at all, that the widow had died long ago, and what remained was nothing but a husk animated by grief and something darker. And yet, despite all the fear, the widow was never directly hostile. She would sometimes be seen at her window, her face framed by the pale glow of the moon, her hollow eyes gazing into the cemetery, as though waiting for someone who would never return. On rare mornings, she would appear at the gate, laying fresh flowers on certain graves, flowers that never seemed to wither, even when the rest of the cemetery was overgrown with weeds and decay. It was as though her presence alone preserved them. The silence surrounding her life gave birth to 1,000 questions. Who was her husband? Why had she chosen such a morbid place to remain when she could have moved away? And what secret kept her tied to that house, as if bound by invisible chains? These questions were never answered by the widow herself, for she never spoke to anyone in town. Not once. Instead, she lived her days like a shadow, blending into the silence of the cemetery. But the strangest tales were told by those who had dared to linger too long near her home. They swore they had heard voices carried on the night air, soft, indistinguishable whispers that seemed to rise from the cemetery and seep into the widow's walls. Some claimed to have seen figures moving among the gravestones, even when no burials had taken place in years. Others described the sound of weeping, not human, but deep, echoing, as though the earth itself was mourning. And always, in the center of these stories, was the widow, silent, watchful, and unchanging, as if time itself could not touch her. No one knew if the stories were born from superstition or if there was truth buried within them. But one thing was certain. The widow had become part of the cemetery, as inseparable from it as the graves and the trees. And for anyone who dared to ask too many questions, the cemetery offered chilling reminders that some secrets were better left undisturbed. The mystery of the widow deepened with each generation. Parents told their children to keep their distance, warning that nothing good could come from crossing her path. Yet curiosity has always been stronger than fear, and inevitably some were drawn closer to the truth, or at least what they believed to be the truth. It was said that if you watched her house from the cemetery gates at midnight, you would see the flicker of shadows inside, though no one else was visible but her. Some townsfolk described these shapes as human figures, thin grey silhouettes that glided across her walls as though reenacting scenes from the past. Others whispered that these were not spirits at all, but pieces of the widow's soul, fragments of her pain given form. The oldest residents of the town recalled that she had not always been there. Long ago, before the war that scarred their land, she had been a young woman newly married. Her husband, they said, was a soldier who never returned from battle. Heartbroken, she had taken up residence in the house beside the cemetery, where his grave had been marked with a simple stone. But what unsettled people most was the way she remained frozen in grief. Decades passed, and while those around her aged, she stayed the same. Her hair silvered slightly, her skin paled, but she bore none of the wrinkles or weight of time. It was as though sorrow had preserved her. As the years stretched on, the line between widow and ghost blurred. People began to wonder if she had truly ever lived, or if she was nothing more than a phantom conjured by the town's collective memory. Even the children who once dared each other to approach her door grew into adults who swore they had seen her watching them as they buried their own loved ones in that cemetery, always watching, always waiting. One stormy night, a group of teenagers, driven by the thrill of proving their bravery, ventured near the widow's house. They dared one another to look through her window. As lightning split the sky, they saw her seated in a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes open but lifeless. She stared directly into the cemetery, unblinking. And then, as thunder rolled across the hills, the teenagers swore they heard a chorus of whispers, voices calling their names from the darkness. Terrified, they fled, and when they looked back, the widow was gone from her chair. The story spread quickly. The whispers, the gaze, the vanishing figure, it all added to the growing legend. But no one dared confront her. Fear outweighed curiosity. What if she was cursed? What if approaching her meant sharing her fate? The house remained a place of silence, but silence heavy with dread, like the pause between heartbeats before something terrible happens. And yet, despite everything, there was a tragic beauty to her existence. Some pitied her, believing she was trapped in grief, unable to move on. Others despised her, thinking she had chosen to embrace darkness and had become something unnatural. But all agreed on one point: the widow was not like them. She was something else entirely. As time passed, the widow became less a person and more a legend. People spoke of her in hushed tones, as if invoking her name might summon something unwanted. Children grew up hearing tales of her nightly vigils, and visitors to the town were warned not to wander near the cemetery after dark. It was as though the widow had transcended reality, existing in that eerie realm between folklore and nightmare. There was, however, one story that stood out from the rest, one that was whispered not just with fear, but with reverence. An old gravedigger, who had worked in the cemetery before his death, once confessed to a priest that he had seen the widow conversing with someone who was not there. He described how, under the light of the moon, she stood before a certain gravestone, her lips moving, her hands gesturing, as though she was speaking with her long-lost husband. What unsettled him most was not the sight of her talking to the empty air, but the sound he swore he heard in return. A man's voice, faint, hollow, yet unmistakably real. The priest dismissed his confession as the ramblings of a tired old man, but others clung to the tale. Could it be that the widow had found a way to pierce the veil between life and death? Was she merely mourning, or was she actively keeping her husband tethered to this world? If so, at what cost? More unsettling were the disappearances. Every few years, someone in town would vanish without explanation. Sometimes it was a traveler passing through, other times a local who wandered too close to the cemetery at night. Their bodies were never found, and whispers spread that the widow had something to do with it. Perhaps the souls of the living were the price she paid to maintain her unholy bond with the dead. One autumn evening, when the fog was thickest and the cemetery seemed to swallow all sound, a young man named Elias decided to confront the widow. Unlike the others, he did not fear her. His sister had gone missing weeks earlier, and he was desperate for answers. Armed with nothing but a lantern and his determination, he walked the path to her house. The townsfolk watched from a distance, but no one dared follow. Elias knocked on the door. For a moment, there was silence so heavy that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Then the door creaked open, and the widow appeared. She was pale, her hair cascading like a silver waterfall, her eyes dark pools that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. She said nothing, but her presence alone was enough to chill him to the bone. Summoning his courage, Elias demanded to know where his sister was. The widow tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, but something far more unsettling: indifference. Then she stepped aside, silently inviting him in. Against his better judgment, Elias crossed the threshold. What he saw inside was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The walls were covered with faded photographs, portraits of people from the town, some alive, some long dead, and others who had vanished without a trace. Candles burned beneath each picture, their flames flickering as though disturbed by an unseen breath. And in the center of the room stood a small table, upon which lay a collection of personal items: lockets, rings, scraps of fabric. Among them was a ribbon he recognized. It belonged to his sister. His blood ran cold. Before he could speak, the widow closed the door behind him. The sound echoed like the ceiling of a tomb. Elias realized too late that he was not the one seeking answers. He was the one being chosen. The townspeople never saw Elias again. His disappearance was chalked up to the same fate as all the others, swallowed by the mystery of the widow. But whispers of what he had discovered lingered. His lantern had been found at the gates of the cemetery, its flame still burning, though no one could explain how. For weeks afterward, strange things happened in town. People claimed to hear his voice in the night, calling out from the direction of the widow's house. Some swore they saw his figure wandering among the graves, a lantern glowing faintly in his hand, though his eyes were hollow and his face pale as death. The fear of the widow grew. Parents kept their children inside after dusk, and even the bravest men avoided the cemetery. Yet the widow herself remained unchanged, watching, waiting, as though nothing had happened. She moved through her rituals, lighting her candles, tending to the graves with flowers that bloomed unnaturally bright, even in the dead of winter. It was then that a strange pattern began to emerge. The disappearances always happened near the anniversary of her husband's death. It was as if the widow needed a soul to bridge the gap, to keep his spirit close, to renew a pact forged in sorrow and sealed in shadow. Some believed she had made a bargain with death itself, an exchange that demanded the living in order to sustain the dead. The priest of the town, tormented by guilt for ignoring the old gravedigger's confession, decided to confront the widow himself. Armed with holy water and a crucifix, he entered the cemetery at midnight, determined to put an end to her dark influence. He was never seen again. The next morning, the townspeople found his crucifix lying broken at the cemetery gate, its edges blackened as though burned by fire. From then on, no one dared confront her. The widow's power was undeniable, her silence more terrifying than any scream. She had become untouchable, a figure that loomed over the town's history like a living curse. And yet, despite all the fear, there was an undercurrent of fascination. She embodied what everyone feared most, the refusal to let go of death. Her grief was not just personal, it had become eternal, binding the living and the dead in a dance that no one could interrupt. Some nights, travelers passing through would see her standing among the graves, her hands outstretched as though beckoning someone unseen. A cold wind would rise, carrying whispers that made even the strongest men tremble. And always, the cemetery seemed to respond, shadows shifting, ground trembling, air thickening as though the earth itself acknowledged her dominion. The town was trapped in her silence. They could neither banish her nor accept her. They could only endure, watching as she remained unchanged, untouched by time, an eternal widow who fed her sorrow with the souls of the curious, the desperate, and the lost. As decades passed, the strange widow beside the cemetery became a figure woven into the very fabric of the town's identity. People came and went, generations rose and fell, but she remained, always in her house, always near the graves, as though she herself were carved from stone. Some who had left the town as children would return years later to visit relatives, only to find the widow unchanged, her pale face and dark eyes exactly as they remembered. It was as though she was a fixed point in time, unshaken by the world's relentless march forward. The truth, however, was darker than anyone could imagine. One autumn night, when the mist rolled heavier than usual and the moon was hidden behind storm clouds, a merchant traveling through the area sought shelter at her door. Against every warning from the townsfolk, he knocked. To his surprise, the widow welcomed him inside. She offered him food, water, and a place to rest, speaking no words, only moving with slow, deliberate gestures. Exhausted, the man accepted. But in the dead of night, he awoke to the sound of whispers echoing through the house. They did not come from the widow's lips, but from the very walls themselves. The voices called names he did not know, voices of men, women, and children, all overlapping in a chorus of lament. He rose to his feet and followed the sound, which led him into a hidden chamber below the house. There, by the dim glow of candles, he saw rows of coffins, not empty, but sealed tight. On each coffin was carved a name. Some were names he recognized from stories in the town, people who had vanished without explanation. And then he saw Elias's name. Terrified, the merchant stumbled back, but the widow was already there, standing silently in the shadows. For the first time she spoke, her voice low and hollow, as though it carried the weight of centuries. "They are not lost, they are kept." Her words froze him in place. Before he could flee, the candles flared, and the voices rose to a deafening pitch. When the townsfolk found his belongings near the cemetery days later, the merchant was gone. No one ever spoke of him again. The legend grew darker. The townspeople whispered that the widow was no longer a grieving wife, but a collector of souls. She did not merely mourn the dead, she bound them to herself, storing their essence in the depths of her home. Some believed she was creating an army of the dead, others that she was simply unable to let anyone go. Not her husband, not the lost travelers, not even the curious children who had once dared to knock. Her grief had mutated into obsession, and her obsession into a hunger that could never be satisfied. And yet, there was a strange duality to her. Despite everything, the flowers she placed on graves never faded. The air around the cemetery was always crisp, and the bodies of the buried never decayed. It was as if her presence kept the cemetery suspended in a state of eternal preservation, untouched by time or rot. The widow was both guardian and predator, caretaker and curse. By now, she was no longer just a story. She was an unavoidable reality that loomed over the town. People no longer asked who she was or what she wanted. They only prayed to be ignored by her gaze. And then, one fateful night, everything changed. A fire broke out in the village, consuming several homes and forcing people to flee into the night. In the chaos, a group of villagers saw flames spreading dangerously close to the cemetery. Terrified of losing the graves of their ancestors, they rushed to stop the fire, only to find the widow already there. She stood at the gates, her arms raised toward the inferno. And as the flames licked higher, something unexplainable happened. The fire bent away from the cemetery, as if an invisible barrier shielded it. The villagers watched in awe and horror as the flames died out before reaching the graves. When the smoke cleared, the cemetery was untouched, pristine, as if protected by a power beyond human understanding. And there, in the middle of it all, stood the widow, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. She did not acknowledge them, but the message was clear. The dead were hers, and she would never allow them to be disturbed. From that night forward, the town accepted the widow not only as a curse, but also as a necessary guardian. She was the price they paid for peace between the living and the dead. As long as they left her undisturbed, she would maintain the fragile balance. But anyone foolish enough to trespass, to question, or to defy her, would join the whispers beneath her house. Generations later, the widow still stands at her window, unchanged, untouched by the years. Travelers still speak of her presence, children still whisper her name, and the cemetery still blooms with flowers that never die. The line between life and death remains blurred, anchored by her sorrow. And so the strange widow became eternal, a reminder that grief, if clung to too tightly, can transform into something far darker than love. She was not a villain, nor a hero, but something beyond human, a soul caught between two worlds, bound forever to the cemetery beside her home. Impactful conclusion and moral. The tale of the strange widow is more than just a ghost story. It is a reflection of what happens when we refuse to let go of the past. Grief is natural, sorrow is human, but when pain becomes an obsession, it can consume not only the grieving, but also everyone around them. The widow teaches us that love, when twisted by despair, can become a prison. Her story forces us to ask ourselves, what are we holding on to so tightly that it chains us to the past? And what might we become if we refuse to move forward? Sometimes the most frightening monsters are not born from darkness, but from love that has been corrupted by loss. Thank you for watching this video. We ask that you subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, activate the notification bell to be alerted about our new uploads. See you in the next video.